When I was growing up in the 1960s, every August our family took a road trip. Dad behind the wheel, Mom at his side, and my sister and me in the back seat. We left our home in Connecticut for a ride to Virginia, to homecoming, to my dad's church, St. Mary's Baptist Church. The church was always packed. Dad came from a large family. All of the relatives were there. My grandmother was there, aunts, uncles, cousins, and the church was rocking with fiery gospel music and powerful sermons, with the congregation shouting, "Preach and amen" to the pastor. And it was hot. If you know anything about August in Virginia, you know what I mean. Most of the congregation, they had those cardboard fans with the funeral home advertisements on the back of them, fanning themselves. Afterwards, we would walk out onto the front lawn and hug and kiss and catch up with each other because we only saw each other once a year. But during all those homecomings, all those trips to Virginia and going to the service and walking outside onto the lawn afterwards and catching up, I never heard anyone say, "Do you see that piece of land right there? That piece of land right next to this land we're standing on right now? At one time, that was a tobacco field, a tobacco plantation, in fact. And our ancestor, Franklin Braxton, was forced to be a slave on that plantation." I never heard anyone speak of it. It never came up in conversation. Franklin Braxton was my great-grandfather. He was born in 1851. He was one of 8 children born to a slave couple, Nat and Peggy Braxton, who were on a plantation somewhere in Virginia. He was sold 3 times. Eventually, a slaver named Benjamin Davidson purchased him, and Davidson had a tobacco plantation. In 1866, the year after slavery was abolished, the members of the church would organize, and they worshiped outside under a grove of trees and logs. Eventually, they established St. Mary's Baptist Church, and they built the church. The members, they built the church on a foundation. With their own sweat, they built this foundation, and they also built a very simple structure, and they furnished it as well. Franklin was a teenager when he was freed. He and his second wife, Martha, had 11 children, one being Orville Braxton, my grandfather, my father's father. I know these details because they were put into a booklet compiled by a great aunt and also one of my cousins who went to the courthouse and library to pull records to unearth all they could about our family tree. I was thrilled to get these details, but I wanted more. I wanted to know how Franklin felt being enslaved, how long he had with his parents before he was pulled away from them, how he felt being torn from his family. And what about his brothers and sisters? Did he miss them? And what was his life like during slavery and afterwards? I find this frustrating, but I know I'm not alone. How many of us have ancestors who we don't know a whole lot about? How many of us have ancestors who have vanished in history? In West Africa, family history is essential to preserving cultural identity. Griots, or storytellers, they are the keepers of history, and the information they keep is passed on from generation to generation through song and dance and drumming and speech. And that history can take the form of epic stories and narrations and proverbs. Griots can recite genealogy of kings and queens. They are a living archive keeping history alive for centuries. We know that during the Middle Passage, my ancestors and millions of other West Africans were seized from their villages, put in chains, and forced into the bowels of ships, and forced into slavery. They were cut off from their language, their tribe, their culture, their identity. And after slavery was abolished, many wanted to move on. They didn't want to talk about it. And who could blame them? Who would want to relive the trauma and the painful abuse of slavery? For many, the focus was on survival, education, economic advancement, and independence, which might explain why my relatives never brought up the topic of Franklin Braxton after our homecoming service. But Franklin's story is rich and meaningful. I want future generations to know about him. About 50 years after those early trips to homecoming, Mom and Dad were sick and elderly. Mom had ovarian cancer. Dad had dementia and Parkinson's disease. Mom chose home hospice. Sitting with her on the bed in the bedroom, we reminisced about our mother-daughter fun activities. Way back when Mom would bake a chicken, she would pull the wishbone and she would give me one end and I would put my pinky on one end and she would put hers on the other and we'd pull and she'd say, well, whoever gets the largest piece gets to make their wish. But Lisa, if you get the largest piece, just keep it a secret. Don't tell me what your wish is, otherwise it won't come true. And also, when I was about 3 or 4 years old, Mom was a housewife and she would watch the soap operas. And I would get into the stories and I would say, Mommy, why does that man like that lady? I thought he liked that other lady. And she would say, Lisa, you're too young to watch these soap operas. Go back to your room and play with your toys. But then she would get so caught up in the story that she would forget that I was still there. And also, Dad was working overnights at the local factory, and Mom would watch these scary movies at night. And she would be so scared that she would come and get me out of bed to come into her room and sleep with her because she was afraid of the dark. So Mom and I had a lot of lovely reminiscences about that time. And then when my father became more ill, and he passed away 2 years after Mom, I shared a lot of fun memories with him as well. And I didn't want those memories to go away. I didn't want those details to vanish and go silent with me. So I began writing down those memories. They were cathartic for me. They were comforting. They helped me to grieve. I wrote for months until I had enough for an essay collection, which was published as a memoir. It's been read by people who enjoy family stories, who are grieving the loss of a loved one, caregivers who need to be reminded that they're not alone in the hard work they're doing for their loved one. But my most important audience, my most important readers, are my niece and nephew. They knew Mom and Dad as the grandparents who spoiled them rotten, allowing them to play all over the house, to leave their toys everywhere, who took them to church, to the mall, to the candy store, and surrounded them with love for many, many years. My niece and nephew now have a volume of stories about Grandma and Grandpa when they were young parents raising my sister and me. My niece and nephew can also read about what my sister, my little baby sister, was like, their mother, and what I was like, the big sister, when I was a child. I hope my memoir has a profound impact on their lives, filling them with a sense of pride, a deeper understanding of who they are and where they came from. It's a keepsake I hope they pass on to the next generation. And the generation after that, I hope they pass it along too, much like the storytellers in West Africa have done for centuries. So many people wish they knew more about their family history, wish they spent time talking to a relative before they passed away. I challenge you to take steps to learn more about your family history. It might be tough to get family to share their stories, but start where you can. Call them up, spend time with them. Sometimes the best conversations happen when you're doing something together. On those road trips all those years ago to Virginia from Connecticut, for homecoming, my sister in the back seat, me in the back seat, I would ask my parents questions like, why do we live in Connecticut? Why are we not in Virginia, where you're from? And slowly but surely, the stories would come out about racism that they faced during Jim Crow, having to go to the back door of a restaurant for service, having rocks thrown at you as you waited for your school bus, stepping off the sidewalk when a white person came in your direction, having to not look them in the eye, and being subservient with, no sir, yes ma'am, yes sir. And also there were limited job opportunities. I will never forget how my mother's voice would get shaky when she would tell these stories. And Dad sounded so angry. He was fueled with the anger of remembering how it was. These rich stories helped me to understand my parents better. As I did with my parents, ask questions and see where the conversation takes you. Here's one of my favorites. Ask your relative, what did you do for fun when you were a child? Even if they had a hard childhood, at some point, they probably had some fun. They might tell you about the toys they played, the toys they made themselves, the games they played, playmates, mischief they got into. And it goes both ways. Share details about your life. As you build your family story, you're enriching your relationship with your family member. A well-known African writer once said, "When an elder dies, a library burns down." In other words, it's important to learn from the elders before they've passed away. With the passing of a wise elder, a repository of history vanishes. One year, on a flight home with my grandmother, my mother's mother, we had a great time. Grandmother Virginia was afraid to fly by herself, so I flew with her. We were strapped together side by side for 2.5 hours. It was wonderful. I asked grandmother all kinds of questions, and she answered them all. I'd been around grandmother many times, but there were always distractions. People coming by to visit, she was babysitting the grandchildren, or the TV was very loud. On the plane ride, I realized how special she was. I treasured that time together. It was not just conversation. It wasn't just details of this and that, but stories that connected me to my family in a meaningful way. Franklin Braxton passed away in 1909. I had no idea what he looked like. I could find no pictures of him. I may never learn any more about him than I already know. But I do know as an enslaved person, he endured forced labor from sunup to sundown, horrible living conditions, psychological abuse. The fact that he survived, all of that helps to ground me in my ancestry. Every family has fascinating stories, stories of survival, hardship, resilience, and love waiting to be discovered. These stories help to deepen our understanding of ourselves and ensure that our ancestors are not lost to time.